Witam serdecznie w drugim dniu naszej konferencji.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon on the second day of our conference with John Paul II towards the future. I would like to welcome His Eminence, His Excellency, and all the persons who are the speakers and who listen to us. I would like to say hello to everybody from Krakow, from the Archbishop's Palace. So John Paul II, during his last pilgrimage, he said, if anybody asks, the address is Franciszkańska number 3. This is what the Pope said when the people gathered outside were shouting to him, welcome home. Today it is a very special day because our conference coincides with the anniversary of signing the bulla with the nomination of Karol Wojtyła to the Bishop of Krakow, and this was done by Paul VI. And also in 3 days' time we are going to celebrate the anniversary of the announcement. Yesterday we listened to the welcome address of the Archbishop of Krakow, Marek Jędraszewski, who is also the head of the organizational committee of this conference. He introduced us into the reflections concerning the anthropology and ethics. We were looking for the answer to the question concerning the condition of human being. We listened to 4 papers concerning human love, charity, the theology of human body and human dignity, which is reflected in human work. Today, we would like to concentrate on the subject of family and society, and because this is the starting point for everybody's journey in the world. Also, we're going to have a look at politics and the state and the effect of theology onto the understanding of our society. And we will end with broadly understood culture. We had problems with connecting with Cardinal Peter Ereti, and I don't know whether we are able to see him. Not yet. That's why I would like to move towards the first paper today and introduced priest professor Dr. Merecki, and as soon as we get connected to the Archbishop, we'll be grateful to listen to his address. So I would like to introduce the biography of priest Merecki. He was born in 1960. He comes from Salvatorian order. He has a PhD habilitated in philosophy. He was employed by the John Paul Institute of the Catholic Institute of Lublin, and now he works in the Lateran University in Rome, and he's the deputy editor-in-chief of the Ethos Quarterly and also member extraordinary of the Papal Academy, Thomas Aquinas Academy. He translates philosophical and theological literature, and he authored many books and publications concerning John Paul II. Priest Professor is going to discuss the importance of a family as an important instrument of humanization and personalization of contemporary society. Professor, over to you. Thank you very much. I would like to start with the word of thank you for inviting me to this very important conference, which takes place in Krakow. Krakow has connections with 2 important philosophers that I would like to quote, Karol Wojtyła and Roman Ingarden. I would like to have a look at the connection of 2 terms. So the fulfillment of a human being, that is the humanization, and the notion of a family. The analysis of the first terms will have an interesting angle in comparison with Roman Ingarden papers. And the fulfillment of a human being, as understood by Ingarden, will be important to the interpersonal dimension of human existence and with the institutions of marriage and family. If we have a look at the subject, we are going to see two terms in it: the notion of fulfillment, the humanization of a human being, and of the family. Let's begin with the fulfillment of a human being. This term says that a human being is a dynamic being and he can reach the fullness of his existence, but doesn't have to. A human being must conquer, achieve the status of humanity and maintain it with the effort of their spiritual nature. In his beautiful essay on human nature, Roman Ingarden wrote that human nature is about exceeding the limits, the animal limits which are inherent into the human being. Without this mission and without this effort of growing out of the primeval limits, a human being falls back into the pure animalism. So in Ingarden's vision, humanity is both given and ordered. It can be pursued, but it can be lost as well. A human being can identify himself with their animal nature. That is why they might exceed above, reach beyond the animalistic nature. It's not the case of an animal which is always what it is, whereas a human being can always live in accordance with their human nature, but cannot live beyond it. So this truth is very well expressed by the end of the Magic Flute, Sarastre monologue, which is quoted by Robert Sperman in his book about human beings. It's because that a human being is a different representative of their species. That is why we talk about a person. So Sarastre has, who does not accept this teaching, they do not deserve to be human. This sounds paradoxical. To deserve to be a human is somebody who already is a human being. But if we do understand the meaning of this clause, it means that the term a human being is both descriptive and normative. Similarly, as in some case of deeds, we talk about inhumane deeds, but inhumane deeds are committed only by human beings. So to be a human being is an obligation to act in a very special way, reflecting the obligation which is inherent into human nature. Within the context of the moral fulfillment, Wojtyła talks about incidentality of a human being. Every being who does not update their own nature is incidental, but the entire vision of a person presented by Karol Wojtyła, which is pursued within the act, it means that the incidentality of existence and acting, fulfillment and non-fulfillment, it is one of the fundamental dimensions of humanity. In the case of a human being who is incarnated, it means that the incidentality is a question of time. A human being is subject to the to physical principles of time and dynamics. One of the most revealing texts concerning time and exceeding it in a human being that I read was the essay written by Roman Ingarden titled Human Being and Time. In our context, this text seems to be interesting for two reasons. First of all, because Ingarden's vision presented not only in this essay but also in other texts in his book about the human being. So it is close to the concept of the human being, which within the same years was presented by Karol Wojtyła. Secondly, it is because it touches upon these problems, asks the questions which Ingarden was not quite able to answer, because this answer is provided by religion. Ingarden seems to be aware, although he never exceeds the limit of philosophy. As far as I know, Ingarden never accepted religion, although we might believe that in this text he somehow leads us towards religion, and it seems that the answer of religion to the question about time constraints of a human being is not rational. The Krakowian philosopher says that a human being is able to answer the question who they are when they find something permanent in themselves. Let me quote, "All these attempts to kill the time, to overcome or to conceal the time are not able to annihilate in a human being the time of the sparkling knowledge about being lost in time. This knowledge, or rather a sense, is a source of a new despair, of a new escape of a human being from themselves. This anxiety will be removed by those who would feel the traces of being that is not conditioned by time. How to find such being? A human being must concentrate first of all on their own being, not to be tempted by divertissement, which, according to Ingarden, might lead to the human being losing their own essence. So finding in oneself the traces of what's permanent is to serve the permanent values which are not transient. A human being, as Ingarden says, may withdraw to their own animalistic nature by losing their essence, but also they may exceed beyond the limits of animalistic nature. In such a way, they create permanent values. And this is the closure of Ingarden's essay on time, which in an interesting way is seen in an objective manner and expresses the emotions of analysis. Quote, who am I, this piece of flesh and bones, but myself, the blood and bones growing out of the limits of physicality? I am the force that multiplies itself, creates itself, and exceeds itself as long as the force is able to concentrate without yielding to suffering or pleasure. Reading these words, it's difficult not to remember the concise definition of a person present in Karol Wojtyła. To be oneself means to exceed oneself. Transcendence is a different name of a person. According to Wojtyła, it is being a human is the ability to exceed oneself in the quest for the truth, goodness, and beauty, which is defined in the person and act. So we talk about the true goodness or true beauty, which are stressed so much to show that the morality grows out of the normative power. As Wojtyła would say, depending on the truth is the condition for morality and the condition of being a person. So once you are determined by the truth, dependent on truth, as Tadeusz Styczeń would say, a person can be fulfilled as a person, as a human being. Values of the truth, goodness, and beauty are permanent and are not limited by time. Even those who embody these values pass the values remain. We still admire the beautiful works of the spirit left for us by our predecessors. In his personal act, a human being is able to be elevated beyond and above the limits of time. How permanent are the values of the truth, goodness, and beauty? It seems that the beautiful vision of a human being that undergoes the effect of the values discussed by Ingarden, because the truth, goodness, and beauty are the transcendental, that is, personal values. They exist as long as they exist within the person who perceives them. So in the world without persons, they would not exist, and all axiological differentiations would not make any sense at all. They would be like music recorded on a digital record with zeros and ones, but they would exist only when anybody would be able to hear them. So quite surprisingly, it is not the values that guarantee the permanence of persons, but it is the persons that make the values last. With some reservations, human beings, because of their incidentality, are not strong enough to provide the values with permanent aspect. These values can last when the person exists, the person that does not pass within the time, and in whom the values of the truth, goodness, and beauty can guarantee permanent existence. In such a perspective, our existence in time, through which we execute values, is a preparation for the permanent existence, getting mature for the eternity. In the comment to Psalm number 4 by Robert Spearman, I found a metaphor which refers to our subject. A human being, or even an animal, needs an open space for their existence. Any enclosure is connected with the limitation of the freedom, that is, the limitation or even the annihilation of being. For a human being, this open space is not only physical but also spiritual. Also, it is the friendliness that they encounter from others. Persons exist in this space of recognition. That is why human being needs not only the satisfaction of their material needs, but also the fulfillment of their fundamental instincts. They need the existence of communio personarum. It is the only way to go through their life. Even if it's very vulnerable and full of suffering, it is justified. Without such justification, without benevolence from others, which affirms our existence, it is good that you are here. The development of a human being is not possible. That is why the values which help a human being to find fulfillment are possible only in relations with other persons. What is more, only then a human being can reveal on the phenomenal space their personal dimension, which belongs to their existence, but it is carried out only in the interpersonal dimension. That is why the family, which I'm trying to show, is the permanent place for human existence and fulfillment, not in the biological dimension, but in a personal one. In that sense, we can say that a family makes a condition for the fulfillment of the transcendence of a human being towards the world of nature, which is quoted both by Ingarden and Wojtyła in their essays.
Substance.
And so a person is at the same time a substance and a relationship. A classical definition of the person that Wojtyła refers to in his text, The Person in Act, emphasizes the substantial dimension of the person. The person is an individual substance of a rational nature. One should not forget, however, that the very concept of the person was derived in the Western thought in order to elaborate everything that pertains to the revelation regarding the relationship between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit that the New Testament reveals to us, as well as the relationship between the divine nature and the human nature of Jesus Christ. That theological origin of the concept of the person indicates that from the very beginning, it is understood as existing in the community of people. A human being in the contemporary culture is understood as an autonomous unit, as an autonomous individual who has to go through a process of socialization first. And that process requires, on many occasions, the use of coercion, or in any ways, a limitation of the primarily unlimited freedom of mankind. And so this sort of unity in diversity is only possible when realized as a unity in diversity accomplished through the community of love. Its counterpart in our human experience is the love experience between man and woman that lies at the very foundation of marriage and family. In John Paul II's theology of the body, that love is treated as the image and likeness of divine love, whose dimension is so profound that in the interpretation of the Polish Pope, a man accomplishes his and her likeness to God even more within the relationship with another person than when they live alone. That theological discourse has its equivalent in the human experience. Before the theology of the body, Wojtyła discusses it in his play entitled The Jeweler's Shop, and especially in the first act of the play, in which he describes the birth of marital love. From a certain point in time, that thought starts to accompany all other thoughts, becomes the criterion of all, even the most banal day-to-day choices. One person opens up to the other in such a way that they become part of the other person, in such a way that the two entities, the I and the you, start creating a quasi-collective subject of we. It is not a subject so ontologically strong as is the case of the Holy Trinity, but there certainly is some analogy here. It is one of the most important manifestations of the transcendent nature of human being as contrasted with the world of nature. My professor, Professor Rocco Buttiglione, used to explain what the collective I is. And he did that in the following way, quote, when some friend or acquaintance asks me whether I would like to go to the seaside or to hike in the mountains, I usually tell him, I don't know, I need to ask my wife. I don't do it because I feel dominated by my wife or I'm afraid of taking any decision without asking her first, but I do it because my love for my wife is much greater than my likeness of the mountains or the seaside. And so I don't really know what I want myself if I don't know what my wife wants first. Let's move on to discuss the family and the transcendent nature of the person. The marriage and family has a privileged place in the accomplishment of the transcendent nature of the human person. It is a place within which we go beyond staying focused on our own and aspiring at satisfying our own natural instincts, and instead we open up to the other affirming the other. Spearman would have said that the other stops to be the Umwelt and starts to be recognized as the Selbststein. I think it's worth pointing out that in the humanist studies, the significance of family was indicated by Sigmund Freud and Claude Lévi-Strauss. In the analyses of Lévi-Strauss, it is usually emphasized that the relationship of closeness and friendship helps us counteract the primeval hostility, as referred to by Hobbes. The relationships of kinship are a condition for the creation of the human culture. There is another important aspect of incest, namely the fact that parents may not treat their children as a potential object of sexual desire indicates that from the very beginning, the child is placed in a position of an empowered entity, somebody who has value in their own, of their own, not someone who might be used as an object. Now, it is within the family that we carry out and accomplish the type of communication that Niklas Luhmann used to refer to as total communication. It is the type of communication that does not encompass only a fragment of a person, but its entirety. And so in different social relations that we experience, social recognition is often attributed to a function that we hold, that we perform. In our relations within the public sphere, we play different parts. And none of those parts is exhaustive. None of those parts exhaust who we are. On the other hand, the family gives us this space to be ourselves. We can put off the mask that helps us achieve the recognition of others in the public sphere, and we can be ourselves. And it is very important to have such a space in order to maintain psychological balance. And so the public sphere is subject to the rule of exchange, but the family is based on the principle of the gift. And so you receive recognition in your family for nothing, because within our family, we receive everything in a manner that is quite selfless. And so in that sense, the family is the archetype of ethical relationships. The selfless nature of familial recognition helps us arrive at an affirmation of personal dignity. And so first, you experience such affirmation from your parents, starting from the mother first. And so it is the mother who's the first one to communicate the truth to her children. And so the mother responds in a positive way to our desires, to our needs. In classical philosophy, we usually say that every entity is good, and that theoretical truth is experienced in life through the mediation of our parents. It is thanks to our parents that we accomplish the existential certainty that our existence is good, and that the primary interpersonal relationship is not about hostility and competition, but it's all about mutual care and recognizing our self. I'd like to mention something else here. In the relationship between the mother, the father, and the child, it is the mother's role primarily to convey the truth about the goodness of being. On the other hand, at least from a certain point in time, it is the father's role to disrupt the almost symbiotic relationship of the child with the mother and to help introduce the child into the reality where not everything is given for granted, not everything is given for free. That process is often difficult, is often marred with conflicts, but it is indispensable in the shaping of the mature personality of human beings. It is true that the family not always performs its function well, but it is not a reason to weaken the family or substitute the family with another system. It is rather a reason for us to search for ways to heal families. No other institution is capable of accomplishing all those roles in the process of maturation of the human person. What it also indicates is that from the anthropological point of view, the family is more basic than the concept of the state or the law. When referring to Aristotle, we might say that not only historically, but primarily ontologically, the familial community precedes the political community. Now let's go back to the vision of Wojtyła, who understands the human being as a person with their individual freedom and dignity. In the marital relationship, the man crosses or goes beyond that nature and accomplishes their goals as a person. And so the human being is no longer reduced to human sexuality. And human sexuality is not experienced at the level of nature solely, but at the level of the person. That is, a human being wishes not just to satisfy their instincts, but to embark on a personal relationship that we call love. Moreover, that relationship also gives rise to a number of roles that are going to last for an entire lifetime. The role of the mother, the role of the father, the role of the child, grandfather, grandmother, and so forth. And in thus understood marriage and family, what is materialized is the basic structure of the person that Wojtyła refers to as the transcendent person in action. And this is an entity that on the one hand possesses itself, but on the other hand can offer himself or herself as a gift to the other. Now, just to conclude, let me add that we are now on a brink of the contemporary vision of the human being. The human being is understood not really as a person, but as an individual who aspires to at an affirmation of himself or herself, even at the cost of others. It is Hegel's dialectics that might be invoked here. Wojtyła does not reject that notion that people have that potential of amor sui usque ad contemptum Dei, to quote the words of Saint Augustine. But Wojtyła believes that that is not the primeval truth on human beings, because human beings have the capacity to go beyond themselves, to pursue the absolute truth, to pursue the truth about the other. And in that affirmation, in the affirmation of that truth, to find fulfillment of the human person. And this is what our families teach us. Thank you, Professor, for that beautiful introductory speech. Thank you for helping us understand what a family is from a highly philosophical standpoint. Thank you for shedding light on that perspective to us. Karol Wojtyła used to explain it to us. Karol Wojtyła often referred to it as joy, as happiness, having that capacity to offer yourself as a gift. We will now switch over to Italian. I'd like to introduce our next guest. It will be Cardinal Peter ERDtomb. I'm very happy that His Eminence is with us. Well, I could talk at length about his accomplishments, but I will try to be brief. His Eminence was born in Budapest in 1952. When he was 23, he was ordained as a priest, and later on he studied in Rome. He was also affiliated with the University of Budapest, where he taught, and later on became the president of the university. He was ordained as cardinal by John Paul II, and following the death of John Paul II, he was the youngest cardinal of the conclave that selected Benedict XVI as the next pope. He was the president of the Hungarian Episcopal circles, and he was granted the title of Doctor Honoris Causa by the University of Washington. Later on, he was president of the Episcopal Commission, of the European Episcopal Commission. And I had the pleasure to meet His Eminence in person. And so I can give my own testimony and tell you that he is a great, but at the same time, a very humble person indeed. So over to you, Your Eminence. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this session. I'm very happy to be part of this conference organized on the 100th anniversary of Karol Wojtyła's birth. I do apologize for coming late, but anyways, I will only make a short introduction. It will not be an in-depth analysis as the one offered by the previous speaker. And so the subject of today is the family and the society. We're trying to answer the questions of what sort of a family, what sort of a society we want to see ahead of us. So Familiaris Consortio is the exhortation that I would like to quote at the outset. These days, as the Holy Father writes, the family is a somewhat different institution, is an institution that has been changing dynamically. Many families still adhere to the principles of their faith, and that is the foundation of the institution of family. But other families have become confused when faced with their tasks. Some families are quite lost and appear to be doubting the significance of the family life. And still some other families have experienced injustice as regards the accomplishment of their fundamental rights. And so being aware of the fact that family and marriage are amongst the most fundamental, the most important goods of the Catholic Church, we would like to give back the voice to all those who appreciate the value of families and try to follow the life of the faithful, and those who are still searching for the truth, or those who may not follow the path of marital life, we would like to support them. And so the Church offers its service to each and every one, to each and every person who would like to combine with another person within a family, within a marital union. And so we might even refer to Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution here. We can see how the teachings of the Holy Father are in line with the doctrine of the Second Vatican Council, and in particular with the Gaudium et Spes Constitution. The substance of the family and its creative mission constitutes a part of the great project of the Creator. And so the good news, the gospel that is conveyed to people by Christ and later on reiterated by the church, needs to be the beacon for us to follow. We see how the institution of a family, when it's stable in the history of humanity, then what it means to us is not that we need to remain quite radically entrenched in our convictions. No, because nowadays we face a number of new challenges that we did not have in the past. So in this difficult situation, we are called upon to support families, to enlighten all those who are uncertain, and to help all those who have been treated unjustly and may not realize their true calling and vocation.
Therefore, there were very important general assemblies of the bishops' meeting in 2013 and 2015. During those meetings, we had a very vast perspective of the practical difficulties and theoretical difficulties which the institution of a family faces today. Amoris Laetitia, written by Pope Francis, talks about many subjects like these, especially in the second chapter, which discusses the reality of families, of family life, and their situation and challenges. And in this chapter, we start with the foundations laid by John Paul II in Familiaris Consortio, and the first quotation comes directly from this work. And it is also stressed that the good of the family is the most important for the world and for the church. Also, this reference to the goodness of the family occurs in many places of the text, which is also the call to understand the mystery of the marriage and family. Pope Francis refers to the anthropological changes, transformations in culture, to deeper understanding of communication between within the marriage between the husband and wife, and the support for their emotional and family life to much a lesser degree than it was in the past. But also we observe that there is a risk of excessive individualism, which has a tendency to isolate all members of the family and puts the idea that a subject must pursue first and foremost their own desires in the first place. This tendency is added with the violence and stress of contemporary world, the world of the work and society. So all the factors that pose a serious danger for long-term decisions. Out of this all, there is this all leads to the decrease of the number of marriages, even civil marriages. Therefore, in some societies, the problems of the spiritual support, spiritual communities of people who are divorced or who are remarried, but only in a civil marriage, is a reality which must be treated with delicacy, but also in a coherent way. It is the problem that in many societies comes to the second level because comes to the background because many people actually are not married even in civil marriages, but the relationships are not formal. That is why the church needs to respect families and marriages and also assist them in solving problems or in educating children. Pope Francis believes that in these facts, which were quoted here, these facts reflect the decline of culture, which is not an assistance for love, quite contrary. Sometimes we say that we live in an ephemeral culture. For Christians, the issues of culture and society are not a standard. It is more a challenge to preach the gospel also in a situation of the great need, great desire of humanity and a human being suffering within the environment which should provide a human being with happiness, that is family life and married life. The conferences of today will analyze the family as a tool for humanization and personalization of societies, as we said, and as we listened to in the previous contribution, in the contribution of Professor Merecki. If a family is so important for a society, Christians whose vocation is to create the society within the spirit of gospel should not give up their participation in public life to support these values. We listened to we're going to listen to the presentation on the subject delivered by Professor Weigel. On the same occasion, I would like to say that my father, when he listened to the news on the Council of Vatican, of the Second Council of Vatican, he said that from the communist countries, very few bishops, very few participants could take part in the council. That is why you could believe that political parties should be formed and important posts assumed, but in some countries everything required the acceptance of atheistic ideology, and that is why the negation of the true faith. That is why the history of Christianity was analyzed in a form many centuries back, when the faith needed to be defended, also defended against the official authorities. Yet this problem at that time seemed to be important in a different perspective than now. But in those years, the atmosphere could be changed, not only within societies, but also around them. In the long run, such a declaration such a testimony could bring fruit. After this presentation, we are going to listen to the testimony of Professor MONIKA Grigel, and then we're going to listen to the presentation of Piotr Mazurkiewicz concerning the theory of the state, which is necessary for solving all the problems on a public level. Finally, Stanisław Grigel will discuss culture, which is the most important power. And also in contemporary months, we see how important this is, the culture of life, the culture of charity, which is represented by Christians, seem to be a great chance also for the future of our world. Thank you very much for your attention.
Grazie mille.
Thank you very much, Your Eminency. This statement, this beautiful statement, which tells us that a human being proposes, but God decides. So in this way, we would like to close the first part of the conference and you have summarized it very nicely and beautifully. Also, you have shown this within the context of the teaching of John Paul II. I would like to thank also for connection, because it is a great experience which confirms that the unity of thought and the unity of church remains unchanged. Now I would like to switch into English.
He was born in 1951 in Baltimore. He's an author of numerous books, including the best-selling biography of Pope John Paul II, Witness to Hope, translated in more than 10 languages. He's distinguished senior fellow of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, is a Catholic theologian, and one of America's leading public intellectuals. He has been awarded the honorary doctorates, the Papal Cross Pro Ecclesia Pontifice, and the Gloria Artis Gold Medal by the Republic of Poland. Serves on the boards of directors of several organizations dedicated to human rights and the cause of religious freedom. He is a member of the editorial board of First Things, happily married father of 3 children. Professor Weigel will present speech entitled "The Late Faithful Cannot Also Abdicate Participation in Politics." Professor Weigel, good morning, first of all, because in America it's now noon. So good morning, and I am pleased to give you the floor.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. It's good to see so many old friends on this conference link up today. And thank you to all of the organizers for inviting me to join you. I would like to dedicate my remarks today to the memory of 2 great men who looked toward the future through the eyes of John Paul II. Even as John Paul II was deepening and developing the Church's social doctrine in Rome, Cardinal Franciszek Macharski was living that social doctrine as Archbishop of Krakow, especially during the difficult martial law period. 1 week ago today, Father Maciej Zięba, Dominican, was buried in Wrocław. Father Maciej was a tireless public catechist in Poland and throughout the world of the magisterium of John Paul II, and especially of John Paul's social doctrine. I was privileged to call both of these men friends, and I worked closely with Father Maciej for 30 years. I hope that my comments here today would please both Cardinal Macharski and Father Maciej, as what I will say reflect many of our conversations. We meet today at a time of great stress throughout the democratic world, which needs the wisdom of Catholic social doctrine if the West is to escape its present moral cultural incoherence and renew its democratic way of life. I hope that this conference helps clarify just what it is that the Church offers the world through the magisterium of John Paul II, who foresaw many of the challenges we face today and had penetrating insights into the roots of those challenges. The why and the how of lay Catholic action in public life and politics come into focus when we look at 2 great encyclicals published by Pope St. John Paul II in 1991. Redemptoris Missio, the Mission of the Redeemer, and Centesimus Annus on the 100th anniversary of Rerum Novarum. Centesimus Annus offers us a detailed vision of the free and virtuous society of the 21st century. It defines the unique role of the institutional church in public life, and it suggests that lay Catholics bear a special responsibility for Catholic witness in public affairs. Redemptoris Missio, for its part, calls the church to live as a missionary communion dedicated to bringing the leaven of the gospel into all spheres of human activity, including public affairs and politics. Redemptoris Missio also commits the church to a strategy of persuasion in all its evangelical and missionary activities. Key themes in these encyclicals illuminate the question of lay Catholics and public affairs. So let us begin with Centesimus Annus. The first key theme: the free and virtuous society of the 21st century, John Paul II teaches, will be composed of three interlocking parts: a democratic political community, a free or market-centered economy, and a vibrant public moral culture. I have a little picture here that I hope illustrates what I mean here. And as you see from the picture, it's the third sector, the public moral culture, that is the key to the entire edifice. Why is that the case? It's the case because free politics and free economics unleash tremendous human energies. What will discipline and direct those energies so that the net results are individual human flourishing and social solidarity in the pursuit of the common good? According to John Paul II, that task, disciplining and directing the energies of freedom, belongs primarily to a robust public moral culture. A public moral culture anchored to the truths about the human person and human societies that we can know from both reason and revelation. The second key theme in Centesimus Annus: democracy and the market are not machines that can run by themselves. This is a mistake frequently made in both political theory and economic theory today, and it needs correcting. Neither democracy nor a free economy is a machine that can run by itself. Getting the structures of politics and economic life properly organized is important, but it takes a certain critical mass of people living certain virtues to make democratic politics and free economics work, so that, as I said a moment ago, the net result is individual human flourishing and social solidarity in pursuit of the common good. The task of that public moral culture, that third sector, is to form the habits of heart and mind, the virtues that inform and direct the lives of those who make the machinery of democracy and the market work. And the primary public task of the church is to shape that public moral culture by effective teaching, witness, and catechesis. The primary task of the institutional church is not, therefore, to be a political actor, but a culture former. A brief footnote to this: I have often thought that this insistence on the priority of culture in democratic politics and free economics was so important to John Paul II and was so stressed by him because of his experience of the Second World War. Weimar Germany, Germany between the First and Second World Wars, or at least Germany between 1921 and 1933, had a beautifully constructed democratic constitution. Max Weber, one of the founding fathers of sociology, was one of the authors of the Weimar Constitution. And yet within 12 years, that beautifully constructed structure helped produce the tyranny of German National Socialism. Why? Because the cultural foundation was insufficient to sustain the structure when the pressures of the Great Depression and a variety of other historical factors were brought to bear on that structure. I think John Paul II knew that experience somehow in his bones, and it's what led him to think and teach that the priority focus of the church's activity in public affairs must be on building and sustaining the public moral culture capable of making democracy and the market work properly. The third key theme in Centesimus Annus has to do with the nature of freedom. Freedom, John Paul II teaches, must be tethered to truth, tied to truth, and ordered to goodness if freedom is not to self-destruct. This is a profoundly countercultural idea in Western high culture and indeed in Western popular culture today. Throughout the Western world, freedom is typically associated with willfulness. Freedom is the exercise of my will, period. Freedom is choice. It's as if William of Ockham had been reincarnated throughout the Western world. This is not a proper understanding of freedom in the mind of the church, and certainly not in the mind of John Paul II. John Paul II would never have agreed with that great moral philosopher, Frank Sinatra, that freedom means I did it my way. But how many people in the West today think of freedom in precisely those terms? I did it my way. Freedom, rather, according to Centesimus Annus, freedom lived nobly involves men and women freely choosing the right things for the right reasons and doing so as a matter of moral habit or virtue. Freedom in public life, freedom in a democracy, does not mean doing whatever we like, but as John Paul II put it in a homily in my native Baltimore in 1995, freedom is having the right to do what we ought. In all of this, I think John Paul II drew on the work of the Belgian Dominican moral theologian Servé Pinckaers, who distinguishes in his brilliant book, The Sources of Christian Ethics, between what he calls freedom of indifference, I did it my way, and freedom for excellence. That's an important distinction for the church to bring into public life. The freedom of indifference a freedom indifferent to truth, a freedom confused about the good, is not the kind of freedom that can lead to a noble democratic political community. Freedom for excellence, freely choosing the right thing, which we can know by reason as well as revelation, and doing so as a matter of habit, that's the kind of freedom that makes democracy possible. So a proper catechesis of the meaning of freedom is thus essential to the democratic future if Catholics are to bring gospel truths into the public square. A fourth key theme in Centesimus Annus is that natural human associations, for example, the family, and voluntary associations, religious communities, businesses, trade unions, social and cultural groups, are essential to the free and virtuous society. That is, the free and virtuous society is not simply the autonomous individual on the one hand and the state on the other. In Centesimus Annus, John Paul II teaches that these natural and voluntary associations are what he calls the first schools of freedom. I can illustrate this by my grandchildren, of whom I have 5. The youngest of whom is 18 months old. Then there's a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 13-year-old. Every 2-year-old who has ever lived in this world is a natural-born tyrant. I think we all know that. I mean, when you're 2 years old, what you want it now, you want it because you want it, and that's all there is to say about it. What happens? How do those beautiful little 2-year-old tyrants become civil, tolerant, respectful, and mature citizens capable of living freedom nobly and living it in concert with others? They don't learn that from the state. We certainly should have learned that from the 20th century. They don't learn it from the state. They learn it in civil society, beginning with the family. The family, Cardinal Erdo was speaking of so powerfully a moment ago, the family is the first school of freedom, because the family is where all of those beautiful little 2-year-old tyrants begin to be transformed into mature citizens. Moreover, John Paul II writes in Centesimus Annus, those natural and voluntary associations embody what he called the subjectivity of society, which means that society is not simply a numerical aggregate of individuals. Society is a community of persons. And that community of persons is formed in part by one of the 4 great foundational principles of Catholic social doctrine, namely the principle of solidarity. Now, from these 4 key themes, first, the free and virtuous society is democratic polity, market economy, vibrant public moral culture, of which the public moral culture is most important. That's the first thing. Second, democracy and the market are not machines that can run by themselves. It takes a critical mass of virtuous people to make those work. Third, freedom must be tethered to truth and ordered to goodness, if freedom is not to self-destruct. And fourth, natural and voluntary associations are crucial to the free and virtuous society, From those four key themes of Centesimus Annus, some conclusions can be drawn. First, in public life, the primary role of the Church's ordained leadership is the formation of a vibrant public moral culture. This is the ecclesia docens in the public square. The primary role of lay Catholics is to bring the moral truths we know from both reason and revelation into public life, including politics and governance. Secondly, the Church as church has, as John Paul II put it, no technical solutions to offer in matters of public policy. The official church's engagement in the public policy debate should take place at a deeper level, the clarification of moral principle and its application to public policy. As the Pope wrote in paragraph 47 of Centesimus Annus, the Church respects the legitimate autonomy of the democratic order and is not entitled to express preferences for this or that institutional or constitutional solution. Her contribution to the political order is precisely her vision of the dignity of the person, revealed in all its fullness in the mystery of the incarnate Word. Thus, the Church should not suggest that there is a correct Catholic position on every contested issue of public policy. There isn't. It is not within the competence of the Church to decide that bicameral legislatures are better than unicameral legislatures, that parliamentary systems are better than presidential systems, that the top tax rate should be 28% or 31% or 14% or whatever. That's not within the Church's competence. Suggesting that there is a correct Catholic position on these technical issues of public policy weakens the Church's teaching and witness on the most important issues, such as the inalienable right to life and religious freedom. Third, the Church cannot be and should take care not to be perceived as a partisan political force or a partisan actor. That is a contradiction of the Eucharistic character of the Church. Priests and bishops who preside over the Eucharistic liturgy and its expression of the Church's unity should thus take care not to act as or be perceived as partisans. This was a key theme in John Paul II's critique of certain Latin American liberation theologies, and it is also a clear implication of the ecclesiology of Centesimus Annus. Fourth, responsibility for forming and sustaining the vibrant, truth-based, public moral culture essential to the free society is shared by the lay faithful and the pastors of the Church. Therefore, an ongoing conversation between pastors and laity about the most effective ways to live out the Church's witness in public life is essential. Now, let's go to Redemptoris Missio. Redemptoris Missio is the Magna Carta of the new evangelization. And the new evangelization is the Catholic Church's grand strategy for the 21st century and the third millennium. The entire thrust of modern Catholic history, from Pope Leo XIII, 1878 to 1903, through the Second Vatican Council, as authoritatively interpreted by John Paul II and Benedict XVI, the entire thrust of modern Catholic history points toward the recovery of the Church's original constituting self-understanding as an evangelical or missionary enterprise, which is to say, the first task of the Church is to preach the gospel. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, teaching them all that I have commanded you, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. That conclusion to St. Matthew's Gospel is the charter of the Church. Because of that, every Christian is baptized into a missionary vocation. We are all missionaries. Missionaries are not simply brave men and women who go to difficult parts of the world. We are all baptized into a missionary vocation. As John Paul II put it in a homily in 1998, baptism is also a source of apostolic dynamism. The missionary work of the baptized, in conformity with their own vocation, is extensively considered by the Council, which in the Constitution Lumen Gentium teaches each disciple of Christ has the obligation of spreading the faith to the best of his ability. In the encyclical Redemptoris Missio, I stress that by virtue of baptism, all lay people are missionaries. This missionary character of discipleship was also stressed by the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which at number 1270 states, reborn as sons of God, the baptized must profess before men the faith they have received from God through the Church and participate in the apostolic and missionary activity of the people of God. This also means that mission territory is not confined to those parts of the world in which the gospel has not yet been proclaimed. Mission territory is everywhere, which means that mission territory includes public life, the formation of political culture, and the daily work of politics in democratic societies. Now, according to John Paul II, the primary missionaries in public life, including politics, are lay people. Lay people are to continue Christ's saving mission in the world, which is the primary location in which the lay faithful fulfill their Christian vocation. By doing so, lay people sanctify the world, the family, culture, economic life, and politics. That teaching of Redemptoris Missio was anticipated a few years before in John Paul II's post-synodal apostolic exhortation, Christi Fideles Laici, where the Pope writes at paragraph 42, in order to achieve their task, directed to the Christian animation of the temporal order in the sense of serving persons and society, the lay faithful are never to relinquish their participation in public life. That is, in the many different economic, social, legislative, administrative, and cultural areas which are intended to promote organically and institutionally the common good. The lay faithful must bear witness to those human and gospel values that are intimately connected with political activity itself, such as liberty and justice, solidarity, faithful and unselfish dedication to the good of all. Thus, lay Catholics have a baptismal responsibility to be witnesses to Christ and the gospel in all aspects of public life, including political life. No baptized Catholic is absolved from meeting the demands of civic responsibility. And in democratic societies, fulfilling this civic responsibility will include holding public officials accountable for their fidelity to the norms of justice. That is primarily a lay role. That is primarily a lay role and a lay responsibility. So, some thoughts by way of conclusion. First, lay Catholics should regard participation in public life as an integral part of their Christian vocation and as one means of living out their baptismal responsibilities. The lay Catholic enters the political arena not simply to seek power, but to serve the common good. Second, in democratic societies, lay Catholics will live out their baptismal responsibility to participate in public life in various ways. As educators of their children, as teachers, as Christian witnesses in public debate, as journalists and commentators, and as public officials. There is no single model of the engaged lay Catholic. Church, according to John Paul II, is committed to the method of freedom. As John Paul II wrote in paragraph 39 of Redemptoris Missio, the Church proposes, she imposes nothing. She respects individuals and cultures, and she honors the sanctuary of conscience. That does not mean, of course, that the Church is not a truth teller, but the method of truth telling is the method of persuasion. The primary responsibility, this would be the fourth point, the primary responsibility of the Church's ordained pastors is to form a well-catechized laity capable of exercising the lay role of evangelizing public life. Fifth, both pastors and lay Catholics actively engaged in public life should honor John Paul II's teaching on the Church's commitment to a method of persuasion by speaking in such a way that those who do not share Catholic theological convictions can hear and engage what Catholics are saying. Arguments based on moral reason, accessible to all, not appeals to ecclesiastical authority, should characterize the Catholic voice in public life and in political debate. That is both good manners. One ought to speak in a way that one can be heard, and it's good politics. You're not going to persuade people if you're speaking a language they can't hear. If I may take an example here from the United States. For over 40 years now, the bishops of the United States have been leaders in the movement to defend the inalienable right to life. In making their case for a society in which every child is welcomed in life and protected in law, the bishops have not appealed to ecclesiastical authority. They have used genuinely public arguments. Biology tells us that the product of human conception is a human being with his or her own unique genetic identity. The first principles of justice tell us that every innocent human life deserves the protection of the law. This has, I think, been an example of John Paul II's method of persuasion, and it has had real effects in culture, in politics, and in law. John Paul II always stressed living in the truth as the key to the revolution of conscience that made possible the nonviolent political revolution of 1989, which brought down communist tyranny and opened Central and Eastern Europe to democracy. Living in the truth is essential for democracies, and a democratic politics that does not attend to the essential truths about the human person and society is going to find itself in serious trouble. To bring, to bring those truths into public life and politics is a work of persuasion. It is best done by well-formed lay people who have been formed by the church's pastors as responsible citizens, some of whom will take up politics as a vocation. So pastors and lay Catholics active in public life should be in constant and intense conversation. Doing so will make the church's public witness more credible and effective. Doing so will help all of us look into the future of public life through the eyes of John Paul II. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Weigel, especially for this recalling us very clearly about our common vocation for being missionaries, and as well of the sanctification of the whole world. So thank you very much. And by the way, the best greetings to all your family and especially to grandchildren. A teraz, mówiąc też o tych zależnościach rodzinnych, będzie mi niezmiernie...
Speaking of family relationships, I am very happy to welcome MONIKA Grygiel. MONIKA Grygiel has been working for a long time in Rome now as a psychiatrist. She used to teach at the John Paul II Institute. Presently, she's active in the actions of the Veritas Amoris project, and in her private life, she's a happy mother of 2 children. I can only add one more interesting piece of information. So what was especially moving for me was when I asked MONIKA how old she was when she met Karol Wojtyła. And she told me, she responded to my email immediately, it was when I was born. So I'm sure we may call her a longtime friend of Karol Wojtyła. MONIKA, over to you. Thank you. I will be speaking Italian. So we will now switch over to Italian.
Thank you very much for inviting me here to share the simple and joyful experience that I had in meeting John Paul II when I was a small child. But similarly, as in all life, the things that we remember from our childhood seem to be very important in our entire lives. There is a number of such memories, and they are intertwined with the history of our family and many historic moments that I witnessed. When I got to know John Paul II, I was a small baby because my parents knew Karol Wojtyła. So at the start, I was really a small girl. I have a few memories from that time. For example, dancing during a ball in Archbishop's Palace, or one of the meetings, very important ones, which brought tears to my eyes when the Pope went to conclave when he was elected to become the Pope. I was afraid of this meeting because it was a meeting and a farewell. John Paul II was a very warm person, participating in the life of his friends and inviting us to participate in his life. He was a joyful person, even if he did not hide the moments of suffering or melancholy or even being irritated. At some point, I saw him very nervous or irritated by the situations around him. So I remember some dinners that my parents were invited to in Archbishop's Palace and also in Rome. My parents, myself, my brother, we were invited. We were kids at that time. We were in the secondary school, and all the time our friendship, our relationship lasted. When we were children and we took part in those dinners, we did not understand the discussions of our parents, of the adults. We were quite bored, and John Paul II looked at us, he smiled, he winked at us. So he wanted to make us laugh, to make us active participants of that meeting. He liked to give us a hug. He gave us a kiss to say hello. He would sing with us. We went for walks. He enjoyed walking and sports. So I remember that often during winter or in March, we would go outside after dinner to the balcony and we prayed together. On an evening like that, he took my hand and he said to me, "Monika, look at the sky, so many stars are there. I go outside in the evenings when nobody sees me and I try to discern the stars from the planes." And he was a person who valued true friendships. He had a gift for recognizing a true friend. He was a very good friend himself. He was able to listen, to ask for advice, and in spite of many difficult experiences in life, he never stopped this habit. He had a number of passions, for example, a passion for mountains, and I know that he knew what love is. He was able to love, and he was able to fall in love. To fall in love with somebody or with something, an idea in life. He supported families. He knew what a family life was. He loved a family. He understood it, and he knew what a family life was. He really liked it because he also lived within a family. It was his Vatican family at that time. It was himself, 2 secretaries from Poland, and also nuns who followed him from Krakow. It was his Vatican family, and he loved having dinner with friends, with the people that he liked. He enjoyed long discussions with them, and like in a family, the moments of dining together were of special importance. People would talk a lot at that time. It was a moment full of enjoying the communion with others. This gave us a sense of safety. For example, for me, I left Krakow. My friends stayed there. Some of my relatives stayed there as well. So my Vatican family, also my Vatican family with John Paul II, was a kind of point of reference for me. I will never forget his look, his steps. I remember the sound of his steps when he walked from his own rooms, walking downstairs to dine. I remember the way he looked into the eyes. I remember his smile. He was always curious what we did and what we thought. I also remember that he loved life, that he enjoyed life in all its dimensions, those more beautiful and those which were difficult as well. I remember a situation that after one of his stays in Gemelli Clinic, I was at internship there. I had my internship there. I wanted to leave a card for the Pope with the get better wishes, get well soon wishes. But one of the persons who looked after him recognized me, and she said, "Doctor, please come inside, come into his room." So I was in his room, and I was wearing my green hospital scrub uniform, and I could be in his room when he was in a hospital bed. And this was a very touching moment for me. I was there, we talked for a moment, exchanged just a few remarks. Certainly, John Paul II experienced also in his life a number of difficult moments, but he never imposed his suffering on us. And although these experiences were difficult, he would always remain himself. So whoever experienced that, he or she would know what I mean. How he behaved resulted in the creation of some kind of community, intergenerational community. It's really important, especially for me. He had the ability to associate people who were inspired by him and who together with him created projects, shared their thoughts, created an idea, some culture, some roots, provided some roots for further things to develop. So everything came out of love, out of his great love for humanity. And this is something that remains and that it lasts in our generation and will last even further. It is something that will always belong to his history and to the memories of him. This is a sign of his greatness. I also think that about many institutions which were created thanks to him, like the Institute of Family or Veritas Amoris. So these are the places which are marked by his presence. I remember that during a dinner, he seemed to be preoccupied by something when he was listening to us. And he had a very characteristic movement with a knife or a fork. He was as if writing something on a napkin, and I was fascinated by that, and we tried to guess what he was writing with his cutlery. So we even were getting into another dimension, which helped us stay very active at the table. I remember sitting in front of him, and at some point I had a feeling that he was talking to somebody, that somebody was behind him, as if I saw God who spoke through him. It was a very strong experience, but it was somehow simple for me because I was only a child, so it was not a complicated experience for me. I treated it as something usual. So I asked him how a human being understands their vocation, and he told me about his own vocation, and he experienced that through meeting people who helped him understand it. And he said, well, do not worry. When the time is right, you will feel it in your heart. You will feel it here, he said, showing my heart, and you will be sure of it. And now, many years after, when I'm thinking about it, I'm really struck by the fact that he would never say, please pray, trust God. He said, listen to your own desires, your thoughts that come directly from your heart. And he said that I will understand it. I would understand it. And this is something that stayed in my heart forever. And I hope that I will be able to teach my children the same thing. The profound love for another person, which is accompanied by the love for God. I believe that this is something that we could not be indifferent to. Knowing John Paul II, knowing who he was, you could not want to be away from him. It was not a momentary fascination or enthusiasm which sometimes shows at a given moment for an event or for a person. Many years after, I still feel that he all the time accompanies me, being always present in my heart. And he accompanies me in my path. And it's not the path towards excellence. It is my path towards being myself, towards being a human being, that is towards what matters most in our lives. I would like this ability to trust, ability to look at the world with your own heart. I would like this ability to be communicated further. I would like to be able to communicate to others because it is the heritage that John Paul II left for me. I would like to communicate it further to those who will come after, whether it's around me or in my family. I would like to thank you for giving me a chance to share my testimony. Monica, yes, the words teach, whereas the examples can attract us. And this was a great grace and joy to look at the example of John Paul II. And this is what everybody wants to have, to be close to the people who are close to God and to get towards God through those people. So we could listen to a doctor, and now we will move on to the healthy theory of the state. And this will be discussed by priest prelate Piotr Mazurkiewicz, born in Warsaw in 1960. He became a priest in 1988, and afterwards he was connected with Emmanuel community. He's a member of the teaching staff of Stefan Wyszyński University in Rome, where he was also the dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences and Economy. He was also the Secretary General of the Committee of the Episcopal, and also he was a member of the Political Studies of the Polish Academy of Sciences, and he was the editor of the board of Society and Politics Journal. He's a priest with deep political thinking, and after today I can also say that he will not hesitate to deliver a sermon only for one person who takes part in the Holy Mass. Over to you. Thank you very much. The Centesimus Annus encyclic contains a sentence in which the Pope observes that for a normal operation of human actions, both spiritual and material ones, we need a healthy theory of a state, or just an introduction of such a theory. Is it present in the texts written of John Paul II? I must say that John Paul II, when experiencing two totalitarian systems, he was a great advocate of democracy, which he perceived as an alternative for authoritarian authorities in Latin America or Central and Eastern Europe. And that is why his main reflections concerning democracy and rule of law can be found in the encyclic which was written immediately after the fall of communism. The Church, he says, respect the rightful autonomy of democracy, and it is not authorized to follow one or another institutional or constitutional option. When writing these words, Pope refers to the Christmas sermon from 1944 delivered by Pius XII, where the Pope, Pius XII, presented the principles of the true and healthy democracy. But he also said that these principles can be pursued equally well in a monarchy or in a republic. So, we can say that quoting this thought of Pius XII says that there is no one universal model of democracy which could be kept in several close pairs and which could be followed or has to be followed by all the states which should apply it in their own country, because democracy is a historical form which grows out of national tradition of a given state. That is why in every democratic state it operates in a different way and has a different institutional shape. The Pope quite briefly discusses the institutional shape of a democracy. So he says that the Church appreciates democracy by means of favoring the participation of citizens in political decisions, providing them with the ability to elect authorities, controllable authorities. So we have the choice, control, and change if necessary, which means that Democrats, when losing power as a result of democratic elections, they do not conspire, but they wait for the next elections. When quoting Leo XIII, John Paul II stresses also the value of institutional division of powers. In Centissimus Annus, he says that it is indicated that every authority should be counterbalanced by other authorities and competences, which would keep the power in the appropriate limits. This is the principle of the rule of law, where the law rules and not the human will. So we have the 5 principles of democracy: the participation of citizens in political decisions, the possibility of electing authorities, controlling the authorities, keeping the power within the limits, and to carry out peaceful change of the government. He says that the rule of narrow elites are not democratic, whether they are bureaucratic or oligarchic, which could pursue their own particular interest. However, he gives a list of 7 principles which the authority should respect when taking political decisions. This is fairness in contacts between the government and the people, transparency in public administration, impartiality in resolving public issues, the respect of the rights of political opponents, the protection of the people defended in processes and before courts, just use of public money, and then rejection of unfair methods of increasing power at all costs. In Centissimus Annus, we read that authentic democracy is possible only in the rule of law and based on the correct concept of a human person. What does it mean? It means that the betrayal of democracy may occur either by means of the violation of formal principles of a democratic state, but also as a result of the attempt to tear democracy from the correct vision of a human being, that is the construction of democracy on an anthropological error. So the formal aspect is stressed.
So there's both the formal aspect and the substantial aspect that are inherently linked with one another in John Paul II's teachings. And so speaking of the healthy theory of the state, John Paul II refers to the Rerum Novarum, where we do not find the theory of the state, but in Rerum Novarum, the Pope does emphasize that there may be differences between citizens within a state, and in fact, without those differences, the state could not exist. And so some people are meant to judge, other people are meant to create laws, and then there are other people still who manage the matters pertaining to the times of peace and the times of war. And so it clearly is a reference to the division of powers. And further on, following Leo XIII, what he says is that political responsibility is much more important from whatever happens in the sphere of economy. So this is what John Paul II stipulates as well. Clearly, John Paul II emphasizes the primacy of politics before the economy. And so whenever we think of the common good, the Pope emphasizes that the common good is moral by nature, primarily, rather than material. And so the common good is not measured with GDP. Systems that are based on materialism or economism, as we sometimes call them, might be measured with different economic indices. On the other hand, John Paul II also stipulates that politics should steer the economy to a certain degree, not to the same degree as it is the case in communist regimes, but still politics may not entirely withdraw from the economic sphere. When commenting on the division of powers, John Paul II alleges that every power should be counterbalanced by other types of power and other scopes of competence. On the one hand, that reflects a realistic vision of the social nature of man. On the other hand, it also reflects the principle of a lawful state. The realistic anthropology has us take into consideration the inalienable dignity of every human person, but also the natural inclination of people to do good, and a common temptation to choose the evil. And so the first element is related to the biblical faith and the creation of men in the image and likeness of God. But on the other hand, we also fall back on the original sin that distorted the natural inclination of people to do good. And so the anthropological argument for the division of powers directly refers to the theology of the original sin. And so the state has to take it into consideration that statistically there is this probability that the inclination to do evil will manifest both amongst the ordinary citizens and amongst those who hold power. And so you need to organize the sphere of politics in such a way so as to make sure that there are not too many opportunities for people to abuse power. And this is why the Pope emphasizes that there is the need for political control or political supervision over the world of economy. And I think that the political consequences of the original sin have been presented very nicely by James Madison when he wrote, "If people were angels, we would not need any authorities. If angels managed people, we would have no need for internal or external control over power." However, we know that this is not the case, and that knowledge, in fact, stems from that realistic anthropological vision. The Pope also invokes his own definition of a law-abiding lawful state, where the highest power is in the hands of the law and not in the willfulness of the people. Now, there are different concepts, different phrases rather used in different languages in the Latin text. And if we consider the Latin text as the original, then the phrase is civitas juris. On the other hand, in English, we have the very well-known phrase, the rule of law, or l'état de droit in French, or das Rechtsstaat in German. And so both in French and in German, the concept of the rule of law is directly associated with the institution of the state, Rechtsstaat. On the other hand, the English rule of law is not necessarily associated with the state. So there's no prerequisite of the state being involved in the rule of law. Now, whenever we think of the rule of law, we need to go back to the ancient Greece, where right from the very beginning, we had those two aspects, abiding by the law, but on the other hand, being equal before the law and through the law. So justice for everyone. Now, further elements in the theory of the rule of law is the equality of the voices of citizens when they participate in elections, and their equality and the access to power. Certainly, whenever we think about the rule of law, what we have in mind is adherence to the law by all, including average, ordinary citizens, but also public officials and so forth. And so every individual who breaks the law may be charged and accused before a court or tribunal. Now, a lengthy text on the rule of law was delivered by the Pope in his speech before the Court of Human Rights. And in that contribution, he discusses the rule of law in details. And he says that governments that adhere to the rule of law accept the limits of their power and their area of influence. And so governments accept the fact that they are also subject to law. They are not above the law. At the same time, the Pope congratulated the Court of Human Rights on the fact that it safeguards the rule of law, because every individual may appeal against a state before the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. And as such, that institution safeguards the rule of law. And I think that should be considered. Unfortunately, we cannot hear the speaker. This is a remark from the booth.
Rozumieniu Jana Pawła II są.
We will now resume interpretation. And so this should be considered against the background of the Marxist ideology. The Court of Human Rights is an external safeguard or guarantor of the rule of law. Now, the concept of the division of powers involves a paradox of sorts. It is the state that exercises control over the appointment of judges, and the state is also responsible for the establishment of the law. But this is the case from time immemorial. Whenever we think about the rule of law, what it means for us is that also when electing our representatives, we need to adhere to certain principles elaborated on by the legislative powers. And so the element of social control is really essential here. Now, the Pope, as has already been mentioned here by Professor Weigel, the Pope has emphasized that right next to our care for institutions, we also need to take care of the empowered citizens, and so citizens should also be involved in the public sphere and the public life. Now, if we consider democracy and the rule of law from the point of view of John Paul II's teachings, he used to emphasize that democracy is not a value per se, but it is instrumental. In other words, it is a measure to accomplish certain goals. And as such, that measure should not be treated as if it was the goal in itself. And so the value of a democratic system depends on what goals it serves to accomplish, what tools it uses to accomplish those goals, and what the moral value behind the goals to be accomplished is, and also what the moral value of the instruments, of the measures used is. Now, let me move on to the substantial aspect now. What the Pope says is that it's important to adhere to the law. And so the ancient principle of the rule of law demanded for the law to be equal, to be equally abided by all. But it also alleged that for the law to be equal and equally abided by all, it has to be well established, well elaborated on. And so we need to have citizens abide by the law, but we also need to have a good law. for them to abide by. So if the state is based on a misinterpreted concept of the person, if the state acts to the detriment of the human beings, then this is a pseudo-lawful country, even though from a procedural point of view, everything seems to be working just fine. I suppose in order for us to understand John Paul II well, it's worth reminding you of Gustav Radbruch's reflections. In a text published in 1946, he reflected on the National Socialism. He tried to understand how it was possible that the Nazis managed to convince not just the troops, but entire crowds of lawyers. And what he says is that we could maybe forgive the soldiers, but lawyers should be more intelligent. This is more or less what he says in a nutshell. But in fact, it was the lawyers that dismantled the system completely and made the society completely vulnerable to the quickly approaching totalitarianism. It was the understanding of the law and its obligations, as Radbruch says, that contributed to the fact that both lawyers as well as ordinary citizens became completely vulnerable vis-a-vis the rights that were established in a willful manner, the laws that were inhumane. And so that theory, in fact, made an equation mark between the power and the law. Where there was power, there was the law. And that was the danger. In his encyclical Evangelium Vitae, John Paul II analyzes the problem. We read, quote, "You might have an impression that everything is done with complete respect of lawfulness, at least in those cases where the rights that accept the termination of pregnancy or euthanasia are voted upon in accordance with the so-called democratic principles. In reality, however, what happens is only a tragic appearance of lawfulness, whereas the democratic ideal is betrayed right at the very outset." And so when referring to totalitarian crimes, the Pope poses the following question: would we stop calling those crimes crimes if they had not been committed by dictators, but rather by the majority of the democratic society? And so the history teaches us that democracy without values is very easily transformed into an overt or covert totalitarian system. So let's think about it once again. If totalitarian crimes were not committed or had not been committed by dictators, but rather by the democratic majority, would we stop calling them crimes? So on the one hand, we are proponents of the rule of law, of democracy, but on the other hand, there are certain laws that are not binding for us in our conscience, that require it from us to oppose them. And so sometimes we need to abide by the laws, but sometimes we need to oppose what only takes on a pretense of law, what only appears to be lawful. And so citizens are not morally obliged to be obedient. Obedience results from the ultimate goals that are to be accomplished. And so if the legal decisions do not serve those ultimate goals, then John Finnis states, quote,
zakresu.
We will now resume interpretation after a short technical glitch. And so what John Finnis says is that if the political decisions that are undertaken do not serve the ultimate moral goals, then these are to be understood only as the private decisions of those who hold power. And so there are certain limits to the obedience of citizens. And what John Paul II points out is that the human rights are derived from a system of values that is deeply rooted in the Christian legacy. And so those fundamental values take precedence against the positive law that only reflects them and is based on them. And if we were to do away with the moral values, we would only be left with a formal system, that is virtually left without a value, stripped of the fundamental value. So wherever democracy is reduced to the rule of the stronger one, you need to come to terms with the fact that the stronger ones may effectively steer the mechanisms of power, but also the process of shaping the public opinion. And so democracy often becomes just an empty word if that is the case. And if you think of, the possibility of blocking social media accounts, blocking servers, then this is quite a clear alarm signal for us. And I suppose the Pope had such situations in mind as well. And what he warned us against was that if you push values to the sidelines, then it often turns out that the stronger ones have the capacity to manipulate the public opinion as well. We are now living through a time of the pandemic. Thinking ahead, we often reflect on John Paul II's teachings and we wonder what the Pope would tell us with the continued pandemic ahead of us. Well, managing societies at the time of a pandemic reminds us of managing or ruling in a state of emergency. And what it indicates is that the traditional division of powers is often distorted because the government mainly resorts to decrees. And so the executive power at a time of a pandemic has more competence than usual. On the other hand, if you look at a certain model of a good citizen, then, over the past year, that model of a good citizen in a democratic state has changed largely, because a good citizen today is one that does not leave their house, that fails to undertake any public activity, that keeps social distance, so stays distant from other people, perceiving them as a potential source of danger. A good citizen is one who wears a facial mask. And Giorgio Agamben, an Italian philosopher, in that context, keeps asking what sort of social relations are possible in such a context of so many social constraints. So what Agamben says Or actually, he warns us against the following situation. Namely, there is a risk that what citizens agree to without protests in an emergency situation might actually become a permanent solution. So a temporary emergency might transform into a permanent one. What is understandable over a period of several months, brings along the danger that we will be accustomed with the constraints, and we might end up perceiving other people as a threat, as a source of danger for many months to come. This is a very contemporary question regarding the rule of law, because if we are to go back to normal, so to say, then perhaps Agamben was overly cautious. But if the constraints are prolonged, then the question of, whether we still live in democratic states remains very up to date. So what John Paul II emphasizes is that the task of religion is, amongst other, to prevent the transformation of politics into a type of a lay messianism. And of course, John Paul II wrote about it in the context of the communist regime, but I'm sure you can read into it today as well. Following Christ, it is not possible to treat this society as an absolute collective. This society and the political power belong to the earthly world, the world that is transient. No social program will never be able to create the kingdom of God. And so political messianism usually leads to the worst forms of tyranny. The structures the societies impose on one another may never satisfy all the goods that human beings desire. They may never replace conscience. They may never replace our desire for the truth and for the absolute. And so religion is supposed to warn societies, warn human beings against placing excessive faith, excessive hope in those false messianistic ideologies. And so perfect life is never attainable on earth. This is one false assumption that is often offered to us. And yet again, we cannot hear the speaker. So we will resume interpretation as soon as we can hear the speaker.
się ofiarą czonej samowoli władzy.
So we need to be apprehensive about false ideologies offering us a vision of perfect life on earth. So John Paul II clearly emphasizes the right to religious freedom, because it is a test of sorts on how well we abide by all other fundamental human rights. In 1989, what he wrote regarding religious freedom was, unfortunately, it is not always the case that religious freedom is guaranteed. In more than one country, we still keep hearing appeals of the faithful, and in particular, Catholics who feel pressured on in terms of their religious practices. It often happens that legal systems and social norms impose drastic limits on the societies, and so the general declarations on respecting religious freedom in fact becomes an empty declaration. Religious freedom is in place only in theory, while the practical restrictions are so radical that the freedom remains theoretical only. You need to remember about it. Freedom is never given to us once and for all. Freedom is something that every human being keeps attaining, and every new generation has to fight for freedom anew. Thank you.
Yeah, dziękuję.
Thank you very much, priest, professor. And the conclusion that comes from such a lecture is that it is the obligation of each of us to grow, to mature to the personal freedom, and also to understand, to follow the understanding of John Paul II, to understand law and the approach to law. Thank you very much, Reverend Professor. All roads lead to Rome, and now let's move from Krakow to Rome again to be connected with Professor Stanisław Grygiel. And I would like to introduce him briefly. He was born in 1935. He was a lecturer and philologist, and he was a disciple of Karol Wojtyła. Unfortunately, we cannot hear the speaker again. We will resume interpretation as soon as we hear the speaker. Apologies from the English booth.
No, ale nic dziwnego.
So, no wonder, because as John Paul II said, that you follow the example of others. And now over to Professor. So he's going to discuss culture as a power stronger than all other powers. Over to you, Professor.
Presente.
Thank you very much for this kind invitation. I'm really happy to be present here, and thank you for the kind introduction. I'm going to discuss culture as the greatest power, the power greater than all other powers. Human lives, the life of people who do not create culture, that is, those who do not cultivate land, is not the true humanity. It is only like a life on a deserted land, on a wasteland. So it's like life on an uncultivated soil. Humanity cannot be anything more. Such humanity will not give any fruit. It serves anything, but at the same time, it serves nothing. Only culture makes the soil fertile, especially the soil cultivated by a human being, and only then the seeds that has been sown can grow into the hope, which is the essence of life. But it is only the soil that was placed on the cultivated land. People whose life makes up culture do not work to work more. They are not only workers who would like to produce even more. They work for something greater. They work for the very culture. They help the soil to give the gift, the fulfillment of which will happen at the end of their expectation. In other words, culture is the culture thanks to the cult that is before it, that is placed before it at the very beginning and at the very end. Let me add that the word culture comes from the verb, Latin verb, which means cultivation of land. So there is no wonder that it is the farmers who understand correctly both what a cult is and what a culture is. Culture without cult is distorted. It is only the production. In Polish, it is production. So people who desert their humanity, they lose the memory of the past and of the future, and by losing it, they become culturally devoid of any importance. A good farmer, therefore, knows his land, his soil. He belongs to the truth of the land, which connects it with the past and with the future of his existence. By belonging to this truth, a good farmer treats their land in the same way as they would treat themselves, and not as an object. A farmer does not exploit the land because the exploitation would deny their own identity. Modernity, after it replaced the truth and replaced it with the word ratio, that is reo, re and ratum, which means to count. It does not respect either land or a human being. It can calculate with stones. That is, ancient Romans calculated with calculi. That signifies small stones, which they found in cogito volo. And these small stones do not show the road that directs people. For cognito volo, everything, including a human being, is the object of use. A human being subjected to cogito volo and his own calculi exchange production into culture, which means that this is the foundation of exploitation of land and human being. In production, which is the surrogate of culture, it lacks truth, goodness, and beauty, verum, bonum, and pulchrum. For production, nothing is sufficiently good to be known and loved. Therefore, there is no place for cognition or for love. Only interest matters. Amon est nomen personae. This is the meditation over life of the Holy Trinity. A human being lives with the art of love, goodness, and art of knowing the truth. A human being knows himself living on the soil and with the people they love and they know, together with the land and together with the others that he or she loves, they make culture. Therefore, they create culture of a community of people. First of all, marriage, family, nation, and church as a community. The seed falls onto the soil, and when 2, 3, 4 are connected, future is kind. But when the seed falls on non-fertile land, it will be annihilated by weeds. The truth of cognition, the goodness of love, means that human being entrusted to the sower, to the divine sower, who in the act of creation casts his word onto the soil of humanity. And in the awe for the work and the act of creation, a human being is transfigured in the holiness in which the truth of a human being is revealed. And this is how I understand the words of John Paul II. That is that faith becomes culture. The beauty of a human being falls onto a human being through culture, like a river, a stream, showing his identity, which is expressed in the ability to love and to know, to cognize, which means that a human being is able to be free. A human being lives with a beauty like a tree lives with the lymph which it drinks from the soil. Beauty is the prerequisite of salvation towards which a human being goes. If the truth and the beauty are present where we have the community of people, it means that the human identity is not individualistic, it is the community. And this is the sense of words, amor est nomen personae. Here we see that human identity is expressed in the joint common presence of people in giving each other, giving oneself to each other. Individuals separated from one another are satisfied by the identity kradio. In Greek, it means some bird species, a species of a bird that lives on its own. It brings the truth and the existence of these birds. And I'm quoting Socrates. So these birds live only by eating, copulating, and flying. They do not do anything else. So the identity of this bird is imposed to a human being in the postmodernistic ideology. Today's culture gives us some surrogates of a family, of marriage, of nation, of church. Therefore, we live in the enclosed enclaves, which are gradually transformed into concentration camps. Tolerance, which was distorted, the understanding of which has been distorted, allows us to do anything we like, to live according to the desire of a restless heart. To quote St. Augustine, so this is the new postmodern culture, does not let us to pursue beauty and truth in God. In the Western world, where everything is calculated, there is a number of such organizations like European Union, which with its little stones, calculi, political or economic ones, they try to bury the source of truth and beauty. The countries whose citizens live as these birds in Greece do not live in a sovereign, independent country. They do not belong to the truth, to goodness and beauty. However, they pursue many things at all costs. Such countries, such people do not continue the work of their predecessors, that is the tradition of freedom, which is expressed by the love for beauty and the desire for truth. The question who you are is answered by them not as what they belong to, but what allows them to have a passive survival in order to escape responsibility. The country of the people reduced to these birds is like with the Ulysses. I am nobody. Nevertheless, Ulysses escaped death and managed to return home, where he was awaited by his wife, his son, and other members of the household. Ulysses is not a favorite character for postmodernism, because postmodernism does not like the fact that Ulysses belongs to the truth, to his marriage and to his family. Cultivation of land of your fathers demands from a human being to be grateful for the predecessors, for the land itself, and for their presence. Culture requires memory. Res geste, that is of previous generations, and res geste of future generations. When you enter the work, when you see the work, you see the work of whom, let me quote St. John here, forever until now. Memory, which horizontally and vertically enters the community of all people, looked towards the common good. Common good is the object of art, the work of art, which should be created together with God and with other people. Greeks would say of this memory that it's divine and human, saying that it is the mother of muses, which inspire all arts, so that they could cultivate the land for the good, because without good, it makes no sense either to live or to die. Therefore, the common good fulfills itself in the community of people, that is marriage, family, nation, and church, and also in the love for the truth. And there it flows out of the secret source, and through the soil it lays the foundation for the communities. The common good is fulfilled in the journey towards the source, in front of which people learn to kneel with humility to drink the living water, which is the quote from the dialogue with Samaritan. And these communities become the common good. This is the common good. Countries follow later on, so that to serve people, families, and nations, but not to operate independently. If the countries were the common good, if the countries operate in this way, they corrupt people and distort history of being human beings, destroy the community, destroy hope of humanity, and they are devoid of the hope for future. The crisis of a family, of a nature, of a nation, of a marriage is the crisis of the entire society. As long as there are united families in the world, families that are united in faith, in fidelity, the humanity will be safe. And as John Paul II says, the future of the world and the future of the church, it lays in the hands of families. Numerous attacks on the institution of marriage, family, and church, first and foremost, want to destroy the culture, because wherever people cultivate land of humanity, the surrogates of a marriage, family, nation, and church will not find any place for existence and for operation. The negation of a marriage, family, and the nation and the church is connected with the negation of the sexual difference, which differentiates and connects at the same time man from woman and man with woman in their pursuit for beauty and truth. The negation of sexual differences implies the deprivation of memory of the act of creation, which means cognitival of human being and his little stones, calculi. And in this memory, we find the most important fundamental values for every human being. Calculi, these small stones, today changed into money, they corrupt, first of all, those who have unlimited access to money, those corrupted people. In order to keep that power, they try to corrupt others. When saying to them not to look into the skies and not to look for the sense of their existence, who wants to understand it, it's important for them to take into consideration the arrogance of the officers in Brussels in relation to Poland and Hungary, because these countries wanted to keep the belief in values which are universal and on whose values these countries are based. The officers of the dark cognitive volo from Brussels do anything to make these two nations betray themselves. According to these officers, it is the money that gives absolute freedom, and this freedom is measured with money. The words of the French president, François Hollande, spoken to Polish Prime Minister Beata Szydło when she definitely said no to the LGBT ideology. He said, "You have your principles, we have the money." And these words should be regarded as a warning that whoever manages the money they are not ante portas, but within the door. So it means that their cogito volo will work as the foundation of the law in Europe, as if European identity could depend on them and not on the truth, which we would like to pursue and which we pursued in Jerusalem on the Calvary Hill. Those who have the money, that is calculi, little stones, impose marriages and families their own laws. They want to impose them the acts on the regulations of births and want them to behave in a non-rational way, in a pervert manner. They would like to distort the union of human being with beauty, with divine and human beauty, so that their life could become immoral, which means that something happened that will not be connected to the past nor to the future.
No, non è.
For the owners of today's cogito volo, a man is not supposed to be born and then to be reborn again, but a man is supposed to become a product so as to be able to produce even more. And so it's all about possessing more and more. Those who cultivate the land, those who defend life from the very first day of existence, those are considered to be enemies to the society and enemies to progress. They are today called fascists or Nazis, only because they refuse to follow the Marxist principle stating that praxis decides on the truth. And they are ready to sacrifice their life, not for the praxis of the others, but for the truth that they believe in. Now, during one of the conferences held in 1977, Karol Wojtyła indicated the foundation of culture, where all persons and communities need to have the strength to say a steadfast no to all those who hate culture, believing it to be a primary threat to power and pleasure. And so he delineated a vision of being a man who can say yes in response to the divine word. He was inspired by the Polish culture, and in particular by the words of the Polish poet Cyprian Kamil Norwid. Cyprian Kamil Norwid, the poet, wrote, "What do you know about beauty? Beauty is a form of love." Thus, beauty is a source of enthusiasm for work. For the Saint Pope John Paul II, those words were very important. He would quote them on a number of occasions. Archbishop Marek Jędraszewski has also quoted the same poet on several occasions. And so for the great Saint Pope John Paul II, the foundation of culture and the foundation of future was love. Love that we're all called upon. And it is love spelled with the capital A. It is love that is created in every hic et nunc. The force of beauty, of love, calls upon every man to create love out of nothing. And so people find love in the gift that they offer of themselves to others and to God. And so freedom and sovereignty of people constitute a unity whose primary paradigm is found in the act of creation of the human being as a man and a woman. Their work for the common good creates culture. They create culture in a dimension in which every one of them knows the truth about their own existence. The man understands himself solely when confronted by the woman, and the woman can understand herself only when confronting herself against the man in front of her. And so those who promote same-sex unions promote deviations, and as a consequence, they promote love that is diseased. They betray themselves. They negate their own origin, their own fidelity. They don't know which way to follow, and so what remains for them is just empty ideology that reduces life to a negation of culture. What it means is that culture is based on a continuous presence of the gift of God, expressed in the act of creation. And the gift has to be accepted by people. If the presence of the gift transcends the world, it also transcends culture. This is the truth of the liberty that men are called upon by God. Whoever fails to cultivate themselves in order to achieve the gift commits a sin by negating culture, by wasting the divine good. Now, ethics form part of culture. It is born when we cultivate the earthly land. So what happens then is what Karol Wojtyła refers to as the moral experience of the human person. Ethics is not yet the experience of salvation. The genius of ethics needs his salvation. And as part of the moral experience, human beings realize that they do not belong to themselves, but they belong to the other, and they will be held accountable for before the other. And so they need to accept the other person or decide to reject them. Those who accept others are strong because the world holds no power over them. Living in unity with another person brings people to the heights where everything is love and nothing is cold calculation. The force of culture results from the seed being thrown on fertile ground. That seed is manifested in everything that can be loved, in everything that can be recognized, that can be admired. So there's both the bonum and the verum and the pulchrum. And the metaphysics of those events is at the very root of culture. Whoever eliminates those metaphysical events from life becomes reduced to seculum, that is, to the time of a single generation, thus corrupting the generation. And so the force of the culture created by Poles who were discussed by John Paul II during his famous contribution at UNESCO in Paris on the 2nd of June 1980, quote, "I am the son of a nation that has survived the greatest experiences of history, that has been condemned to death by the neighborly countries, but has survived and remained true to its identity. It is a nation that has preserved its identity despite the partitions, despite the foreign occupation. It's a nation that has retained its sovereignty, not based on the resources of physical force, but only based on the strength of its culture. That culture transpired to be the greatest force of all." That's end of the quote. Thus, it is absolutely natural that the presence of John Paul II is uncomfortable for the proponents of postmodernism. It's uncomfortable for the members of the contemporary societies. It's also uncomfortable even for the members of the clergy. His attitude is often perceived as uncomfortable, which is why they try to play down the accomplishments of John Paul II in order to justify their own choices. The culture that is based on the cult of God, on the adoration of Christ, requires it from us that we stand before the cross, because it is in the cross that God has placed the seed of resurrection. And that is why people live within a culture rather than within a system of production. Ave crux spes unica. It is on the cross that grass can grow, that reinforces human beings. Human beings who, even though weakened by the seculum, keep fighting against it. The force of the culture, therefore, depends on the stat crux. And ideologies, contemporary ideologies, destroy the primeval case of man, the oikos, created by God and given to people by God for them to live there and manage the land. And so that house is supposed to be populated at all times. It's supposed to be developed. It's supposed to be a combination of human and divine dimensions. But postmodernists make that land or turn that land into a wasteland. They sterilize the land, nomos. And the result of the contemporary battle of oikonomia between the divine principles and the earthly principles, and so the battle between the oikonomia and the calculi depends on the grace of God, and it also depends on how we cultivate the land we've been given. We will see whether we can still climb up the Golgotha mountain. And so our faith, our adherence to the moral principles depends on the results of that battle. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for your patience. Thank you very much, Professor. John Paul II used to say that culture is a way of human existence, and we've learned a lot about human existence today. We've talked about our involvement in public life. We've talked about family life. And now I would like to thank Your Eminence, Reverend Cardinal Peter Erde. I would like to thank all the professors for their contributions and for every enriching remark. I would also like to thank all the participants of today's session, all of those who were with us, thanks to the online connection. Tomorrow we will meet at the same time, and we will reflect on our faith and the life of the Church together with John Paul II, with the great John Paul II. We will try to respond to the question of what sort of a salvation, what sort of a church lies ahead of us. You will find links to the Sunday transmission on the website of our conference. You will also find the link under today's YouTube transmission. Thank you very much for your today's involvement. John Paul II, please pray for us.
Dziękujemy.